Welcome, Sirens! In today's video, I am going to be unboxing and reviewing the Heikala art box. For those of you who are unfamiliar, Heikala is an incredible traditional media artist who recently launched a curated art box featuring some of her most used and favorite art supplies. Full disclosure, I purchased this box with my own money and am making this video because I wanted to. I am not affiliated with her in any way. It came in this adorably illustrated box with all the supplies neatly packaged inside. She even included an illustrated pamphlet that goes into detail about each tool and general advice on using the supplies. Some of the supplies I have already, such as the Pentel Pocket Brush pen, the Faber-Castell Polychromos colored pencils, and the Gtech Fineliner. But there were a number of items such as the inks, masking fluid, and brushes that I was pretty curious about using because I haven't had any experience with these particular brands before. And just as a heads up, I didn't get the chance to use every single item in this box for today's video, but I did try my best to use as many of them as possible, and you will get to see them in action in a painting demo after we go through all of the fun unboxing elements. What I really loved about this art box was how much personalization and care that went into every little detail. The illustrated box, pamphlet, and even the tissue paper makes for such a special experience. Plus, the branded pencil case is adorable, and I can't wait to use it for when I want to bring art supplies with me on the go. I also love that this selection of art tools comes with everything that you need to create an illustration. The only thing that I needed that wasn't included in this box was a palette to mix the inks on. So even if you were someone who didn't have any art supplies to begin with, you would pretty much have everything you need in this box to start an illustration from scratch all the way until a finished product. As with many of my illustrations, I do the sketch on my iPad and print it out onto copy paper, then using a light pad, I transfer the sketch onto the watercolor paper. I used both colored pencils that came in the box, but I found that the pink was a little bit on the light side and I was worried I wasn't going to be legible enough, so I did go over it with a red colored pencil of the same brand. The nice thing about the Faber-Castell Polychromos colored pencils is that because they are oil-based, they don't smudge or disappear when using wet media over top of them. Plus, the lead themselves are quite sturdy, so they can be sharpened to a very, very sharp point to get those really fine details. After the pencil lines are done, I use the washi tape to tape down the edges of the paper onto a masonite board. This watercolor paper actually came in a block where the edges are glued down, but because I wanted to transfer the sketch onto it, I had removed it. But typically with a watercolor block, you're meant to just paint on it straight away to avoid having that extra step. However, either way, this prevents the paper from buckling as you paint and continue to add water to it. Then from there, I began working on the line art using the Pentel Pocket Brush pen. I typically prefer to do colored line art after the painting's pretty much done, but for the sake of this video, I thought it would be fun to approach the piece in a similar manner to Heikala, who typically does the black line art first. I've actually had this pen for quite some time now, and to this day, I find it very hard to control. But the key thing about using this particular pocket brush pen is you have to use very light pressure if you want to be able to achieve those really thin, delicate lines. Another thing to note about it is that you want to wait at least 30 minutes to let the ink completely dry before you begin painting over top of it. I've learned the hard way that it will definitely smudge if you are too impatient. Today's painting is not only a way for me to participate in the very fun MerMay challenge, but I was also influenced by Heikala herself. If you're familiar with her work, you might have picked up on the fact that she does a lot of paintings that have water themes. So for my mermaid slash siren painting, I decided to take some inspiration from this illustration that she did a little while ago of a cute mermaid with a frog in a water lotus pond. Her approach was very light and sweet, whereas for my piece, I decided I wanted it to feel a bit sultry and mildly sinister. After I've let the ink thoroughly dry, I decided to test out the masking fluid. For those of you who don't know, masking fluid is a substance that, once it's dry, protects the surface underneath it from being painted on. It is especially helpful for intricate shapes where you'll be painting large washes of color. Masking fluid can be used in a number of ways, such as with a brush or through a paint marker, but this by far is certainly my favorite method. The nozzle is very fine, so it allows you to get fairly small, detailed areas, and it prevents you from having to destroy your paintbrushes or having to do really any cleanup. Plus, the needle in the lid prevents it from clogging, which is perfect. After the masking fluid is completely dry, I can finally start painting using the acrylic ink and Holbein brushes. I have used other brands of acrylic ink in the past, so I pretty much knew what to expect when painting with these ones. As far as I could tell, they perform just as well as any other brands I've used before, and I more or less approach them the same way as I would when I'm painting with watercolors. The main benefit of using acrylic inks over watercolors is that when the layer is dry, it's totally permanent and will not lift or be disturbed. This is great for doing many thin glazes and washes without worrying about the layer underneath being lifted. But similarly, the downside of acrylic ink is that there's less room for error because you can't lift the paint after it's dry. So if you are the type of person who does a lot of lifting techniques when you use watercolors, that might be a difficult thing for you when using acrylic inks. But thankfully, I don't typically use lifting techniques in my paintings, so that wasn't really a big concern for me. A technique that I did use that is typical for watercolors is the wet on wet technique. You can see with the lotus pads here is that I wet the area first, and then I apply concentrated inks to the paper and allow it to spread and bloom across the surface. This technique creates really nice soft edges and is also really great for creating gradients. In this case though, I decide to leave a space between the two different colors. That way it creates a soft highlight on the lotus pad instead of having them bleed into each other. Like the majority of my paintings, I prefer to build the color and values very slowly with thin washes of color. To create a sense of depth in this piece, I wanted the lotus pads and water closest to the viewer to have the most contrast and saturation. And then, as we moved to the top half of the illustration, I used more diluted washes of ink so that it was much lighter in value and to make it feel like it's more distance and further back from the viewer. Something that you may have noticed already is that the inks dry a little lighter and less saturated than when they are wet. This is why I always recommend having a scrap piece of watercolor paper with you to do little test color swatches if you're worried about laying down the wrong color. Something that I get asked about a lot with painting is how I blend or transition colors. Most of the time, what I do is that I'll put down a blob of color, then I clean the paintbrush off, and then with the clean wet brush, I'll soften the edges of the paint blob. Sounds really scientific, I know. I'm really poor at explaining my process, and so I hope that that kind of makes sense. But I'll say again, the nice thing about using acrylic inks is that you can scrub at the edges or use as much water as you like without worrying about the layer underneath in the same way that you would with watercolors. Because with watercolors, if you scrub or use a ton of water over other layers, it's potentially going to shift or budge. And as you can see with the blush on the face, I will sometimes even add more ink while the area is still wet, using that wet on wet technique that you'd seen me use on the lily pads. That way the color can be even more concentrated and I can take advantage of that blooming effect if I want that soft kind of gradient look. People also often ask me how I get colors to look so vibrant in my paintings. And typically there's two reasons. One, I use many layers, and two, try not to overmix your colors. If you have more than 3 or more pigments in your mixture, the color will typically appear much more muted. For the majority of this mermaid skin, I think I only used the magenta and orange inks to achieve maximum saturation. Which I then carried over to painting her tail. To get some variation, I switched back and forth between the magenta and the orange ink for each scale. This portion was particularly tedious, of course, but I think that the overall effect was worth it. This approach and look to the tail was actually inspired by another piece that Heikala did in how she painted some dragon scales, as well as another artist, Kludwig, who did a similar pattern on one of her illustrations. Then for when the scales that meet her torso, I used the wet on wet technique again to achieve lighter scales so that it would be a more subtle transition from the tail to the skin. Then from there, I continued to layer and layer to achieve the right values and saturations that I wanted, which I must say, this watercolor paper was really nice to work with. There was very minimal warping and the surface handled all the layers and water super well. Of course, this was to be expected since it is a 100% cotton paper, which is definitely ideal for this kind of application and painting technique. As for the brushes, they worked just as well as most of the synthetic paint brushes I've used in the past. They hold a good amount of water and sustain their shape just fine. To be honest, for me, the main benefit of these brushes is that they have plastic handles rather than wooden ones. Traditionally, paintbrushes have wooden handles, which over time, from being soaked in water over and over again, will become brittle and the coat of the paint will crack and break off. Whereas these handles are plastic, so they will likely remain much more resilient and last a longer time. And my particular favorite thing about these brushes that I was looking forward to is the fact that the end of the handle, it's got a slanted edge, and that makes it the perfect tool for scraping off the masking fluid. And thankfully, the masking fluid came off quite easily, and the area was perfectly untouched, and the paper surface wasn't ruined at all. Then at this point in the painting, I can feel that the finish line is near and I'm ready for it to be over. So from here, I am adding in any last minute touches such as some shadows and the line work. And then I quickly paint in the lotus flowers using similar techniques that I used with the lotus pads. Then for the finishing touches, I use the white poster paint to add highlights to her face, create shine on the water, and little water droplets on the lotus pads. And as expected, the washi tape left a nice crisp edge and the paper surface was not damaged from the removal. The one downside that I have with this paper is that the black edges from where it was glued down in the block is tricky to remove. Other watercolor blocks that I have typically use a transparent or white glue for the edges. So for this, the paper itself, I just used a bone folder to remove it from the block, which is no problem, but it's just these black edges that I don't know what to do with. But other than that, the paper is beautiful to work with. Then as a last minute addition, I wanted to show you guys the Pilot Gtech Fineliner, which is great for little details such as the eyelashes. So overall, I absolutely loved using the supplies from Heikala's art box. I believe she said that she's going to release more sometime this month, so I'll link her Instagram down below if you're interested. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.